Good morning, bonjour tout le monde. Thanks everyone for coming. I know many people had a late night last night. It was an excellent night. I enjoyed it very much. The aquarium I came to 15 years ago, so it was with my kids when they were young, so it was good to be back. I'm going to talk about adventures in integration, not just across disciplines, but between science and policy, because that's the interface that I've done a lot of my work at, and I know that many people here also work at that interface. And I've shortened the original title and called it Insights from Interdisciplinary Transgressions, and a transgression is something that you're not supposed to do. And much of the work that I've done is stuff that I probably should not or was not told to do. So I want to show some case studies, among other things, after briefly examining or revisiting what we mean by interdisciplinarity, because there's a drift in that meaning, and I want to sort of bring us back to some more precise definitions, perhaps, of that. And why are we doing it? And then the bulk of my talk is going to be talking about some of the work that I've done that has been interdisciplinary in terms of both research and practice. And my experience is largely in the arena of fisheries and international development, outside the areas of ICES and PICES largely, but in a global and interconnected world, I think a lot of the issues there resonate with people in the regions that ICES and PICES cover as well. We've made the instrumental case for interdisciplinarity, I think, but I want to also propose that it's a way that you can learn new and surprising things, something that I'm going to call serendipity science. And I'm going to finish with, you know, I'm really impressed by how far integration has gone. I remember going to a conference somewhat like this in Nairobi about 15 years ago, and there was a sort of social science fisheries session among a whole bunch of others, and I think I was the only person there, along with the person that had to introduce me and my PhD student who was forced to attend. So, you know, things have moved on. People working across disciplines now are a large group of people. I think at the time in the field of international development, working on fisheries, it was pretty much myself and Christophe Benet, and, you know, a few others as well, but many of them working from biological institutes, whereas I worked in a development studies one. Well, the main reason that we practice interdisciplinarity as applied or policy relevant scientists who seek to be policy relevant is that problems cut across boundaries of any subject matter or discipline. Karl Popper. And the world has problems, but universities have departments, and that statement sort of exemplifies the issue that the way that our institutions are structured doesn't necessarily fit with the nature of the complex problems that we confront. And interdisciplinarity then seeks to sort of break down those barriers in institutions to allow people to work together to address the complex problems. So how do we do interdisciplinarity? Well, there's many different ways of doing it. And disciplinary science, you basically stay within a bounded area, and you have your core journals and institutions and your rules and norms and methodologies, accepted unifying theories sometimes. But sometimes to come together to solve problems, the traditional way has been through multidisciplinarity. And that's top diagram there is somewhat illustrative of my experience of working on sort of EU framework. What framework are we on now? The last one I worked on, I think, was 4 or maybe 5. But you essentially have teams of people who work either in parallel or sequentially. And the size of those dots roughly indicate the distribution of funding that's typical in these projects. Probably on a log scale, you have physical science, which can be expensive, super parallel computing power and ship time and all kinds of other expensive equipment. Teams of biological researchers counting and enumerating things, army of graduate students perhaps. Economics, hiring an economist for a few days, you have to pay them a lot. social scientists end up, well, you know, they sit in cafes and bars, and you just need to pay them a little bit for coffee and beer. So having been more or less at that far end, we often find that these end-to-end projects are underfunded in terms of their ability to integrate, and the job of integration and the job of adding the social component was traditionally rather underfunded. And often what you found yourself in at the end there was that the problem was defined towards this side of the system. Is that the pointer? Yeah. From this end. And the social science component was essentially, you know, tasked with delivering a message that science had come up with through their research, and to make it palatable to whoever was being asked to change their behavior. The advent of interdisciplinarity really brought people together to work more closely, to start to conceptualize research problems jointly rather than in this sequential or hierarchical way. And you can have various intensities of integration in interdisciplinarity, from, you know, the different disciplines sort of communicating regularly to working in overlapping areas and seeking questions and methodologies that combine disciplines, to a complete methodological and conceptual synthesis that takes place from the start. And you know, this might be something like the socio-ecological systems, or the Resilience Center at Stockholm has probably achieved this sort of level of conceptual integration. And then you have transdisciplinarity, which has an integrated academic or theoretical core, but also integrates the knowledge of different kinds of users who are not academics. These round blobs are basically professional researchers, and this group of people interacting are not. So I want to say a little more about transdisciplinarity. Transdisciplinarity really seeks to involve members of society in the research process. So it's more than participatory research, it's more than consultative process. It is engaging with society as members of society, the groups that you intend to work with or who might be affected by the work that you're doing, as co-producers of knowledge. So the idea is that you frame the problem, the issue that you look at, together in consultation with society, rather than the traditional way, which is scientists define the problem and then, you know, persuade society or seek the opinions of people in affected groups through some kind of stakeholder consultation process. Here you're actually framing the problem together, but you're also then working to co-create solutions and translate the science into usable products in the forms of plans and institutional innovations, new technologies, whatever it might be. So it's a very much more integrated process right across from conceptualization to delivery, and it integrates those functions of science and application much more closely than interdisciplinary research, which somewhat relies on traditional kind of pipeline model. You do the science, and then you communicate it, you deliver it, you apply it. Different disciplines have rather different meanings, but in the social ecological systems world, I think these are pretty much the accepted ways of thinking of those. And just as an example of how that translates into a scientific or assessment project, this is one former colleague of mine, Tim Dorr, heads. It's under the Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation Programme, funded by the UK Department for International Development and one of the UK research councils. And this project takes place in East Africa and works very closely with East African fishing communities to identify the drivers of change that are affecting both the ecosystem and their lives, and to use an ecological dynamic model, in this case a sort of ecopath with ecosym, but also through primary stakeholder focus groups to look at and measure well-being linked to the ecological dynamics and the drivers of change. So it's an integrated model. It's transdisciplinary in that it was conceptualized and drawn up in very close collaboration with people in villages in East Africa who are also involved in interpreting the findings of the project and reflecting on them. So they're part of the learning process, part of the research process. And the other feature of this is that it looks at people in differentiated ways. I think often in our modeling we tend to sort of only differentiate people as by economic sector as a particular type of actor, whereas there's an element of social identity differentiation here as well. I mean, notably gender. Okay, so that's an idea about assessment. So what is some of the work that I've done that crosses some of these interdisciplinary boundaries and also crosses into application or policy? My experience of sort of crossing the bridge between the natural sciences and the social sciences, I think in the early days was something like this. I think Beth drew a nice Leonardo da Vinci bridge, which was all beautifully interlocking. But the bridge, certainly in many cases, is something like this. It's a bit of a precarious undertaking to cross it. You risk falling in that water, and in it are the crocodiles of people who would deny you funding, review your papers from all kinds of weird angles, and other hazards like that. So there is a hazard in bridging and crossing these disciplines. But I think increasingly these bridges have become much more secure, and I think this conference is evidence of that. One of the first attempts for work that I did that crossed these kinds of bridges was I was originally working on trying to understand how people coped with resource fluctuations in very dynamic systems. So I was looking at people's livelihoods and their governing institutions in small-scale fisheries that were subject to extreme variations in climate and therefore fishery productivity. And around about that time, people in fisheries started to talk about climate change. I think other people were already talking about it in other sectors. Fisheries sector was a little bit slow at getting on the, I don't want to say bandwagon, but in responding to the policy agenda on climate change. And so we did one, I think was one of the earliest analyses that tried to look at fisheries in the context of climate vulnerability. And we took what was then a fairly new framework from the IPCC. The work was actually done in 2004. It took a while to publish. And we looked at the degree to which fisheries were exposed to climate change, the degree to which national economies were sensitive to any impact that might happen as a result of that exposure. So the number of people employed, the contribution to the food system, and the contribution to exports and so on. And so these were turned into, and I need to get this right in case Linwood is in the audience, indices. And this, of course, the vulnerability is a compound index. And exposure and sensitivity add up to potential impacts, but those are modified by the capacity of society to adapt. You don't know how society is going to adapt, so you need some sort of proxy measure which is that of adaptive capacity, which looks at the resources that are available nationally, potentially to apply, to diversify into other sectors, to eat other food, to buy your way out of the problem of having to pay for climate impacts. And that results in vulnerability. And we produced this global map, which was covered in the press at the time quite a lot. The countries that found themselves most vulnerable wrote about it in their local papers. So it had, in a way, this was almost advocacy science, in that it put the issue of climate change and the potential consequences for national economies on people's radar somewhat. And this happened just before COP15, Copenhagen. And together with FAO and UNEP and others, we went to Copenhagen with the explicit intent of using work like this. And this was pretty much the only one around at the time. There was a lot of sort of biological impacts work that had come out before. to sort of draw people's attention to the potential consequences of climate change for the oceans, because the oceans were nowhere to be seen in the climate policy world. And our intention really was to bring climate change into fisheries and aquaculture policy, but also to bring fish into climate adaptation and mitigation discussions. So, for example, you didn't see in the national plans of adaptation for climate change any mention of fishing communities, simply sometimes because there was nobody in the fisheries department in particular countries that was aware of this process going on. And so there was no relationship between what climate adaptation funds were earmarked to be spent on and the relative severity of, say, terrestrial and aquatic impacts of climate change. So this was part of the situation we were trying to address with this work. And that illustrates really both the crossing of the bridging of two agendas and the bridging of several disciplines, and using that science to inform policy. And really not just being content with publishing a paper and then sort of sitting back and seeing what happened, but actually going to COP15, speaking at Oceans Day, along with Prince Albert of Monaco and a whole bunch of others. Actually, we both had the same suit on, and I was mistaken for him. I think from a distance I sort of... We tried this again recently in terms of still trying to put the oceans on the climate change agenda. After the disappointments of Copenhagen, it was really a while before we felt there was another opportunity. And one opportunity was the recent COP in Paris. And just by coincidence, we'd been asked to write a review which came out in Science, and it was timed to come out just before COP21. And the intent here was really to reflect on the impact that climate change effects on marine systems were going to have on people and how society and people might respond. So we went much more into sort of qualitative social science, but we were sort of pushed back in the direction of some kind of conceptual or schematic model of economic sectors and potential impacts. And so I'm going to show you that a little bit and then move on to some of the more sort of qualitative aspects that we tried to talk about. But we did a sort of schematic of the sectors of the blue economy that were, and we found that the ones that were based on living marine resources, all of them were predicted to be negatively impacted under anthropogenic global environmental change. So, you know, the various impact pathways, and these are the confidence limits from the IPCC reports that these effects will be negative, and these are all negative. But not all sectors of the maritime economy are impacted negatively, and this was a sort of subset of a diagram that's rather difficult to read, but essentially looks at all the elements of climate change impacts on oceans and how they might impact the different maritime industries, divided according to shade of grey as established, emergent, and developing. And the green arrows there are potentially positive impacts. So some of these, you know, the response for industries that are about investing in habitat protection, investing in new technologies might actually benefit, whereas the majority of the established impact industries are going to be negatively affected by climate change. And we wanted to cost this, but the OECD had not yet, I think, released their global blue economy figures. And now that we have them, we might be able to sort of combine these. And if we can figure out what the right discount rates are to use, do a calculation of the potential global impacts of climate change on the maritime economy. So if any economists want to sit down and tackle that with me, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. So that started out as just a sort of minor diversion in the paper, but it ended up sort of taking a lot of the time. You know, sometimes you're pushed around in interdisciplinary work with the different views of referees from different disciplines. What we were also interested in doing was looking at some of the sort of policy implications and some of the contributions of social sciences other than economics. And one of the sort of key questions we asked was, how can you get people to trust the science? How can you convey to society the importance of climate change impacts on the oceans? And the starting point here really was that people are much more worried by things that they experience directly, and many people don't get to directly witness coral bleaching and changes in fish populations and the things that many of you and people involved in the maritime economy do. So we looked at, for example, the psychology of messaging around climate change in the oceans, and there's a growing body of literature that says that scaring people, which is what we tend to do with our science, doesn't do it. And this was research that used a series of images and then looked at people's willingness to get involved in local climate mitigation and adaptation actions, but particularly mitigation actions. And so images like these that sort of made people depressed and scared certainly raises awareness of the issue, but it's very, very demotivating in terms of getting people involved in action. And this research found that non-threatening images that relate to the kind of everyday emotions that we have and the hopes and, for our children, for example, notions of community, these kinds of images were much more motivating in terms of getting people involved in action locally to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And in this case, this is children planting mangroves as coastal protection. Now, you might say that that's, a hopeless thing to do, but or just a gesture, but it gets people involved and interested. And then, if they do that, there's also studies that show if you're involved in these kinds of local activities, you're also more likely to support policies to mitigate climate change. So engaging people requires an understanding of the way that people think and how they react emotionally to the kinds of messages that they're getting, which is one of the contributions that social science can make to a field such as climate change impacts on the oceans. The other area that we highlighted was that there's a variety of civil society responses to climate change that in the marine realm have not really been analyzed specifically. There's tons of books on all this stuff about new social movements, protest movements that have arisen to, address the impacts of climate change and the effects that these civil society movements have on priorities for research, for funding, the way that these groups can be engaged as part of the response, the scientific or the institutional response to climate change is something that we haven't really looked at in the marine context. Okay, so that was one area of transgression outside of, effects of climate on fish. Another area of transgression was when working on fisheries management in places like the Malacca Straits, African Great Lakes, and off the coast of East Africa, issues of maritime crime became very prominent. If we look at, we know that there's a governance deficit in the oceans and around fisheries. And this illustration really shows that many of the societal costs of that deficit are hidden. When we do value them, we tend to value IUU fishing and subsidies. That's the visible bit to our sector. $50 billion a year, according to an analysis that was done a few years ago by FAO, the World Bank, and others. But there are all these hidden costs. Maritime crime, smuggling, people smuggling, drug running, etc. There's also the cost of the loss of climate change adaptive capacity as a result of, for example, stressing ecosystems in various ways. Loss of ecosystem services, then you've got stresses on the human system that cause loss of labor productivity, if you want to stay economistic about it, but also, undermine the viability of societies and people's well-being more generally. So all of this has costs, and we haven't really thought about it. And these are the costs that are imposed by allowing fisheries to be poorly governed. Also, while working on fishing livelihoods, I became aware that there's a huge literature on trying to get people to diversify out of fishing. Too many people catching too many fish is the sort of narrative that drives that. And there is this sort of rather worthy narrative about people diversifying into aquaculture or handicrafts or ecotourism and all these kinds of things. But if you look at what people are actually diversifying into, it's smuggling, cigarettes and alcohol, people. This is a vessel caught at sea trafficking people from Bangladesh to India. And drug running, and a whole host of sort of other crimes. Piracy, which in the Horn of Africa started partially in response to IUU fishing by foreign fishing vessels close to the coast of Somalia. Of course, there were other causes as well, but this costs $7 to $12 billion a year to the maritime economy, largely in raised insurance premiums, but also in terms of lost shipping and lost time. Not all of it is attributable to failing fisheries governance, but we don't know what proportion is. So, if you were trying to add up what is the global societal cost of undergoverned or poorly governed fisheries, it's a difficult calculation to do because this illegal activity is bound up with fishing, but it's not entirely due to fishing. So attribution of partial costs is something that hasn't been attempted as far as I know yet. And of course the area that has sort of gained most resonance recently is the discovery of sort of labor rights violations in global seafood value chains. And this has caused a sort of widespread response among consumers of imported seafood when it was found that there was slavery in the Thai shrimp value chain. The vessels catching the feed that went into the shrimp farming were in some cases employing largely Burmese or Myanmar workers under slave labor conditions. So all of these are indicative of governance deficits, and yet if you look at the research on fisheries governance and you look at the research on fisheries management, it doesn't really deal with this. The research leaders in this area are journalists and NGOs like the Environmental Justice Foundation. It looks like the research community has not really responded to this, and perhaps we haven't made the disciplinary connections with the criminologists, with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and others to allow this kind of research to permeate and inform our decision-making and our responses. Moving into sort of even stranger waters, perhaps. Again, coincidence and transgression across boundaries. I was working on fishing, small-scale fishing livelihoods and the implementation of community-based management or co-management in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was working from a School of International Development at the University of East Anglia at the time. And one of my colleagues was a sociologist who was working on HIV and AIDS. And I initially began talking to him because he was trying to model the number of, for I think it was World Vision, the potential number of orphans, AIDS orphans, this was in the 1990s in southern Africa. And he needed somebody who could handle models. And I used to be a fishery modeler. And the models, population models, demographic models, age-structured models are very similar to the ones that we use. And so I worked with him on this. And then we started these conversations about, he said, well, you really should be working on HIV and AIDS if you're in fishing communities in southern Africa. This is a major problem. And, we didn't really have a frame of reference for doing this, but I got together with a medical anthropologist called Janet Seeley, and we looked to see what information there was on this and wrote a review paper in Fish and Fisheries that sort of tracked the anecdotal information that was out there and then thought through what the consequences might be for the fishing sector, and I lay some of those out there at different scales. And these seem to be quite profound. So we started to look at this more closely and subsequently reviewed more formally the epidemiological data, and this was published in the journal AIDS, which is the sort of leading epidemiology journal. And one of the things that we found here which was very surprising, was that the prevalence of HIV in fishing-dependent communities around the world, and this was not just in sub-Saharan Africa, it included the port of Gloucester, Massachusetts, for example. In fishing communities, HIV prevalence was between 4 and 15 times higher than the national adult seroprevalence in the corresponding countries. And so we compared fisherfolk to other groups that were already known to be at risk and targeted with prevention, treatment, and care. At this stage, nobody was talking about or thinking about fisherfolk as a group at risk. And the figures on this side of the axis here are the national seroprevalence rates, and the figures on the end of each bar there are the prevalence rates for these different groups. And the bars indicate the size of the population likely to be infected in each of those identity or occupational groups. IDUs are intravenous drug users, so commonly regarded as being at very high risk. We didn't include sex workers because it's a category that's extremely difficult to enumerate, to define. The definition of a sex worker is a very blurred thing. And so there aren't many statistics available for HIV prevalence rates in sex workers. But one of the findings was, well, we have these high prevalence rates. In the Indonesia case, 1.4%, which may not sound catastrophic, but it's, given the size of the fishing population in Indonesia, that's 10 times the national seroprevalence rate and potentially 70,000 or more HIV-positive fishermen in Indonesia, or fisherfolk, because this also includes fish workers, female fish workers. And there's been a lot of attention to the Lake Victoria area in HIV and AIDS and fishing communities there. And there you have, in Kenya, around Lake Victoria largely, 1 in 3 fishing people was HIV positive at the time this work was done in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And if you're trying to do community-based management with a population that don't expect to be around to benefit from, the restraint now and the benefits later on that much fishery management pushes as its rationale, then you're probably wasting your time, and you should actually be spending your time trying to get prevention, treatment, and care to these fishing communities to address this situation if you've got any chance of sustaining fish stocks. And so we used that rationale to argue for fishery organizations as well as AIDS organizations to invest in fishing communities. And again, to do that, we transgressed the normal science to policy interface by not only publishing the work as research papers, but using those research papers to convene policy workshops. We did one at FAO, and World Fish got involved before I went to World Fish, actually. And we also got fisherfolk included in the national AIDS response plans from, around the last time I looked, 15 countries, and funding for major projects by CEDA, NORAD, and the German Development Agency, GIZ now. And as a result of those activities, there are now fisherfolk who have access to prevention, treatment, and care, notably around Lake Victoria, access to antiretroviral therapies, which were just nowhere to be seen in fishing communities at the time. And there are fishing communities involved in AIDS vaccine trials because they were, policymakers were convinced that they would make a good cohort population for study on that. And the benefits of that is that you get treatment for participating in those trials. So that's an example of how you start by studying fishery management and you end up in a public health epidemiology project. And my final example is the work that I'm doing more now, which is looking at the connection between seafood or fish, food security, and nutrition. If you look at many of the analysis that's been done up to now by people from the fisheries sector, it tends to focus on these kinds of maps about where people are dependent on fish consumption for a certain proportion of their diet. And the narrative is one that we need to conserve fisheries in order to maintain the supply of protein to people. But if you send this message over to nutritionists, they just say, well, you know, there's hardly anybody that's protein deficient. That's not the issue. Plus, most of the poorest people get the vast majority of their protein from vegetable sources. And so the fact that there's quite a lot of the animal source food is you know, doesn't tell you very much about the nutrition status of those populations. So it's not really about protein. And that's taken a while, and it's taken collaboration with another discipline, nutrition science, to really get that message across. And now that we know that, that fish consumption is largely about the micronutrients and the omega-3 fatty acids and other health benefits that come with that protein, that we're starting to make inroads into the world of public health and getting them to take seriously the incorporation of fish in their sort of food security and nutrition planning. But you also need other kinds of disciplines, not just nutrition scientists. You need to know, you know, which species people eat, which ones they like to eat, which parts they eat, and how they prepare them, because all that affects the nutrition quality as well. And this is a nice picture from a colleague of mine at World Fish, Shakuntala Thilsted. And it really illustrates that if you're talking about vitamin A, which there's a huge problem, 1.3 million people are vitamin A deficient around, died due to vitamin A deficiency around the world, mostly children. And in Bangladesh, I think people get about rural people get about 40% of their vitamin A from fish, surprisingly, not from, you know, the other sources, largely due to lack of access to other sources. And this is the same of things like iron and zinc and even calcium. People who don't have dairy products in their diet get a lot of their calcium from the bones of small fish. And the nutrients are not evenly distributed, so half of your vitamin A is in the eye, so if you don't eat the eye, you're not going to get the benefits. And the other most nutritious parts are the head and the guts, all the bits that we throw away. So if you eat the fillet, you're not getting most of the goodness out of the fish. And, you know, this has implications as you shift, for example, from eating small fish to eating larger farmed fish that come in filleted form, which are now among the cheapest fish on the market. These things are becoming more expensive. And so all of these things need to be understood and considered if you're trying to make a plan to use your fisheries to support food security. So the simple assertion that, oh, we're going to conserve fisheries and this is going to lead to food security benefits is way too simple. It doesn't resolve the complexity of the system sufficiently to make a useful policy intervention. The other thing to bear in mind is that the center of your system is at the periphery of someone else's. So this is a food security framework. This is how people in the world of food security think about the drivers and the sort of factors that affect human health, maternal and child undernutrition in this case. You have to search pretty hard for fish in this. It's there in that lack of capital in the box about natural capital. So it's not specified in any detail at all. And, you know, we would put fish in the middle and then some of this other stuff wouldn't be specified in any detail. So, you know, whenever you think you're doing a systems analysis, you're analyzing system from your perspective, but someone else has a different system analysis and puts something else at the center of theirs. We're moving forward with this research with a couple of projects, one funded by Wellcome Trust and another one by the National Center for Socio-Economic Synthesis in the US. This project has just started, and it's really to try to construct an end-to-end model that looks at changes affecting the marine environment, that's fishery management and climate change are the principal ones that we're looking at to start with. How that affects the abundance of fish, how that is related to catch, how that relates to who gets that fish and who eats it, what the nutrition value of that is, plus everything else that people are eating, and then what the consequences are for people's health. So we're able to model the contribution of fish to micronutrient deficiencies for the first time. And we've got the sort of preliminary results coming out from this in a paper that will appear in Nature in, I think, 2 weeks from today. Just a short commentary, basically introducing the method and the issue and giving the preliminary results. But this is a project that's only just started, And yeah, in a couple of years' time, I hope we'll have quite good estimates. It does rely on the quality of estimates of, how many fish are being caught, and who's consuming them. And there's a real deficit in the model in terms of a supply-demand model. And we're working with Madan Day, who some of you might know, economist who works on supply-demand models, to broaden his Asia fish model and make it global. So to summarize all that then, interdisciplinarity enlarges the scope for sustainability action. So you might think that the only way to manage fisheries, for example, is using your population models and ecosystem models to improve the biological advice for fishery managers. And if that is the only science that you do, that looks like the only entry point that you could have an influence in. But there's lots of other ways that you can influence the fishery socio-ecological system. You can look at options for reforming governance using institutional and policy analysis. You could look at identifying new technologies and market opportunities, different policy options from an economic perspective. You could look at how fishing communities' assets and capabilities can be built using livelihoods analysis, which comes out of sort of microeconomic surveys and participatory rural appraisal. You can look at how to reduce vulnerability and strengthen people's rights to enable them to be better resource managers. And you can do various forms of vulnerability analysis, from climate change to food security. And you can look at human rights and other institutions that affect people's vulnerability, such as by doing a gender analysis. So there's a lot of different research disciplines that can inform how to govern fishery social ecological systems more effectively. And really the instrumental argument for more effective interdisciplinarity leads to more effective solutions to societal problems has been pretty well made. And it has quite a high profile. Even journals like Nature are espousing interdisciplinarity. But what about the sort of creativity, surprise, excitement, and fun of research? I mean, we all know that it's necessary and important, and we should want to do necessary and important things. But most of us got into science because we wanted to do cool stuff and discover things that nobody else had thought of. I think interdisciplinarity offers that option as well. And I'm going to start with the word serendipity, which relates back to the three princes of Serendip, old Arabian story about these three very fortunate young men who stumbled into situations fortuitously and always sort of came out of it really well. They made very wise decisions when they came across unexpected things. And so this notion appealed to, I can't remember who it was now, but it was someone in the 18th century in England who coined the word serendipity to describe this. And it's become very popular in science now. And here's a recent book. I think this is a 2016 book from James Estes that describes this process. And serendipity as a means of sort of accidental discovery has a long history in science, not least here in France. And it's a combination of hasard, or luck, and sagacité, or wisdom. And I'll leave that in French for you. I could attempt to say it, actually. Le hasard dans les découvertes scientifiques ne sourit qu'à ceux qui y sont préparés. And I think that roughly translates as, luck in scientific discovery, or fortune in scientific discovery smiles on only those that are prepared. Okay, so who have invested the time and are, able to recognize a breakthrough and an opportunity when they see it. And here's a good example from the marine sciences. The bioluminescence of jellyfish, observed by Shimomura initially, and who was a chemist, saw the potential and with others isolated green fluorescent protein, which is now used very, very widely to track and understand gene expression in cell biology and in but also to track the progress of diseases and cancers and so on. So it's become a really important tool of cell and medical biology. And he discovered it he isolated it from having spent a summer at Friday Harbor, the University of Washington's Marine Lab. And in 2008, he shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for this work. And I think the French have made a fluorescent rabbit, by the way. Another transformative idea which had a marine spark was an interdisciplinary project in plate tectonics. And the acceptance of continental drift has transformed the earth sciences from a group of rather unimaginative studies based on pedestrian interpretations of natural phenomena into a unified science that holds the promise of great intellectual and practical advances, says one of the people who helped develop the theory. Of course, it originates with Alfred Wegener more than a century back, but it took 50 years for Wegener's theory to gain any credibility, partly because it was so interdisciplinary that nobody knew enough to be able to sort of evaluate it as a whole theory. And what tended to happen was that his disciplinary peers evaluated bits of it, and if he'd made some minor error, they jumped on him and said, oh, that's rubbish. And so, he was kind of discredited and ridiculed about it, and it never got traction until people discovered the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and began to sort of piece the thing together. And it was really, I think, in the early 1970s that it became an accepted theory, and that the explanations of it didn't really sort of get widely known until as recently as the 1980s. And it's transformed the way that we think about the Earth. So how do you become a serendipitous scientist? First of all, you have to have a prepared mind, so that when you encounter that unexpected event, you recognize its importance and the potential for it. You then have to seize the moment. So you have to take a risk at that point. If you're, in a place where people will say, that's dumb, don't do that, or that's a distraction, don't do that. You then have to be persistent against opposition. You have to amplify the effects, and you have to be able to evaluate them to reappraise whether the idea still has potential. So there is this sort of iterative process. And this takes place unconsciously in the kinds of people who tend to do this sort of work. But you can, in some senses, prepare for it. Can you prepare for it institutionally as well? This is the so-called Swiss cheese model. If these things line up, then you can have a serendipitous outcome. I'd say a conducive institutional environment rather than a physical one. Will you be discouraged from exploring novel syntheses? Or will you be encouraged? Lack of time pressure certainly helps for free thinking. Implicit awareness of the need and opportunity, and then an open mind for connections. And once again, it's this open-mindedness that I think is very necessary if we want to progress as a sort of interdisciplinary group, working together to identify these sort of novel syntheses and opportunities. Okay, so finally, what are we missing? How much time have I got, by the way? Getting close to time to wrap up. Okay. We don't seem to, the things that are missing, I think, we've done a great job, I think, of synthesizing across some of the more quantitative social sciences. We've incorporated qualitative social sciences, and I think, Beth's talk showed how effectively that can be done in a quantitative model. Some of the things that we miss might be the things that you lose when you reduce the qualitative sciences to something that allows you to sort of parameterize a model and look at it, at alternative behaviors of a model system in a mathematical sense. And one of them might be the study of power. I'm not sure that the field has yet got a sort of mature reflection on, things like we see the blue economy developing, and in social sciences there is a critique of, for example, the notion that the oceans should or can be privatized. Who's going to grab them? Who do they belong to? Who should they belong to? Who should decide what they get used for? Do we trust the corporate sector to govern them responsibly? how responsible is corporate social responsibility, and so on. We've heard about, for example, Exxon having good science about climate change some time ago and then choosing not to act on that science. So, power and agendas are important things to study, and this is what social scientists study. And I'm not sure that I yet see it in the kind of social science that is seen as incorporated within the sort of human dimensions work that many people do here. I don't think we sufficiently account for social difference and historical injustice in our human dimensions work. Gender work is usually done to sort of enumerate how many people work in different sectors and to look at, say, economic disparities sometimes, but we tend not to go sort of further than that in the analysis. And as the impacts of Hurricane Katrina on New Orleans showed, things like ethnic identity really matter in terms of differential vulnerability. I think now, how many years are we? About a decade after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, there are now 100,000 less African Americans in New Orleans than there were at that time. The demographics of the population has changed because they were living in the most flood vulnerable areas and were least able to recover from that and to go back to their homes. So the economic inequalities from racism in that part of the US translated into climate vulnerability, into disaster vulnerability, which has had demographic effects that are still being felt. They've changed the city. We use economics more than we use ethics when we're framing policy advice. There are some exceptions, and we heard earlier Katie Longo was talking a little bit about fair trade in certification in fisheries. But we don't tend to use a formal ethical framework when evaluating decisions in the way that we use a formal economic model. And we could. There are ethical decision-making frameworks out there. Our policy advisory work tends to be somewhat ahistorical, and we see this, for example, in the creation of marine protected areas, which are predicated on this idea that the oceans were pristine, or the parts of the ocean were pristine, and if we understand the longer history of the relationship between people and the sea, the Anthropocene started on the beach. We've had a long relationship with coastal waters and near-shore waters. And understanding that relationship and how it's changed is a really important part of designing institutions to meet the aspirations of future generations. And if we don't take that history into account, we risk not learning its lessons, but also not understanding the path dependencies and contingencies and context of each place. Okay, just to wrap up then. Social science may seem very complicated, but really there's only a few fundamental questions at the root of it in this kind of context. The first one is, well, where are we going? Where's the system going? And I think we do a pretty good job as a group of addressing that one. Is this desirable? The ones I've highlighted in a different color there are more political questions, really. They're not scientific ones. Who benefits and who is losing out? That's that socially differentiated research. That is a legitimate research area. Which mechanisms of power, again, keep us on course or push us off course? Again, that's a legitimate area for social inquiry. And what should be done, again, that is more of a sort of societal decision-making rather than just a research question. So we're doing well at where we're going. We're perhaps not doing enough about who benefits and who's losing from all our decisions. And the mechanisms of power, I think we're under-theorizing and under-analyzing them at the moment. What I've illustrated really is one of two complementary ways of thinking about how do you get your research to influence sectoral policy more. And I was thinking about how the model, and exemplified very neatly by Beth's excellent talk, how issues of climate change, food security, health, trade, etc., can be incorporated as forcing functions or as variables within a model such as Atlantis. The approach that I've taken is rather to take the fish and insert it into all of these sections, rather than these sectors, and their analyses and their models and their way of thinking, rather than to take the understanding from those other disciplines and then put it within our model. And I think you possibly need both. In terms of having policy influence, I'm not sure which one works better. I'm not sure whether having a good fishery model helps you get fisheries incorporated into climate adaptation plans, for example. Maybe it does. Or whether trying to take fisheries into the climate adaptation world does it more effectively. It's probably very context specific. There's a precedent for this in the health sector, where many of our innovations take place because of its importance. And it's called the Health in All Policies approach. Started in the EU in 2006, actually with Finland, I think. And it's really trying to put health into all of the areas that health is important for. And really what I've tried to do is to put fish in the places that it's important, to put it into international development discussions where fish oceans were largely missing. So finally, I'm advocating interdisciplinarity, but I'm not saying that we don't need disciplines. Almost just semantically, interdisciplinarity needs disciplines. But if everyone was interdisciplinary, then we wouldn't get the sort of depth of knowledge, critical theory building and understanding, and the years and years of specialist training that it takes to become familiar with some of the disciplines that we really, really need to understand the systems that we work on. So this is not a plea for everybody to become interdisciplinary. It's a plea to perhaps regard interdisciplinary work and disciplinary work as being of equal value. The partnership between them is the strength. And equal respect across disciplines with their very, very different standards and methodologies, I think, is a key to successful interdisciplinary collaboration. You can't say, my discipline has greater explanatory power or rigor than yours. That gets you pretty much nowhere. So it's useful to have interdisciplinarity, but you can also use it as a site of innovation and surprise. And so people who have that inclination perhaps shouldn't be discouraged from it. And that might be something that we talk about in the young scholars workshop later. Okay, thanks very much. I just leave you with some West Coast hippie stuff. Gregory Bateson, also a British transplant to the West Coast of the US, was an interdisciplinarian, former husband of Margaret Mead, anthropologist and feminist, and he very much sort of proposed this idea that we shouldn't get, and I think Serge started with this, that we shouldn't assume that we can control the environments that we study, and that we have to let go of the fallacy of control somewhat. And somewhat idealistic, but I think, just worth bearing in mind, and I like the picture.